Anyway, I will start with a little overview of what we do, and then we can talk a little bit about the watersheds and challenges we have, and even some solutions maybe. I don't ever want to leave people with the doomsday scenario at the end. So, um, anyway, hopefully we can be fairly informal. And to those of you online, I may miss hands. I will, hopefully I'll remember to look for hands at the end, but just keep trying. If I don't recognize you, I will endeavor to do so before we end. So,
We'll help you out.
awesome. Okay, so here we go. So this is the overview. Good, you can still see it. Santa Cruz Water Department doesn't just serve the city of Santa Cruz, it serves all the way to 42nd Avenue and then all the way up to Bonnie Doon Road and as far north as up into Rolling Woods. So we serve almost 100,000 people. That's actually a key cutoff point under the Safe Drinking Water Act. If once you're over 100,000, you're considered a different kind of district and the standards are slightly different. So we're just below that 100,000. Um, we actually serve way more people than we used to, and we use less water. So that's something to remember. Yeah. Um, it's positive. It does also remind us like, man, they must have been pretty inefficient back in the day, but certainly water efficiency has gotten better over time with conservation technology and whatnot, and just the consciousness of people. So we're mostly a surface water agency, meaning most of our water comes from streams. Um, that does present a problem during drought and during certain times of the year, like summer and fall, when the stream flows are really low. And increasingly, we're trying to provide flow for fish. So that's something to be mindful of as we go through this. And we really are working more regionally with, say, Scotts Valley, Soquel Creek, San Lorenzo Valley Water District, much more so than we used to. So I've been with the city for over 30 years now, and I've been able to see that evolution, which is kind of nice that I'll just use one example. When I first started, my boss said, don't go below Highway 1 when you're working on the river because that's public works territory, for lack of a better term. And we're all about upstream of Highway 1. And now we're really thinking like, okay, we share a groundwater basin with Mid-County and with this Santa Margarita groundwater basin with Scotts Valley and others. So we're really trying to manage water resources on a regional basis, which of course is how that should be. I may be biased, but I think that's how it should be. So, and there's a lot more info about the water department at that link below if you want to get into that. Um, but what I do as the watershed manager is two broad things, environmental regulatory compliance and drinking water source protection. So drinking water source protection is actually a term of art from the Safe Drinking Water Act as updated under the Clinton administration in the mid 90s, where basically the Safe Drinking Water Act codified something that some water purveyors have been doing forever, which is protecting their source water at the source. Go figure, seems like kind of a no-brainer, but New York City's been doing it forever. Boston's been doing it forever. San Francisco's been doing it forever. I'm sure cities all over the globe have been doing that, but it wasn't until the mid 90s that that was part of the Safe Drinking Water Act that surface water purveyors had to engage in watershed protection. Um, we also, of course, to quote a friend of mine, you can't swing a dead cat in Santa Cruz without hitting an endangered species. So we have a lot of regulatory compliance issues that we need to deal with, whether it's diverting water or fixing a pipeline or what have you. There's a lot of sort of nuts and bolts work that goes on with delivering water to almost 100,000 people. So we often have a need for permits from the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the Coastal Commission or the county, or the list goes on. So we have quite a lot of that kind of work. Um, and I will get a little bit more into the weeds now. Um, Starting with our favorite watershed, the San Lorenzo. I could probably do a talk on just the San Lorenzo watershed, and many of you probably already know all the interesting details, but there's such a rich cultural history and natural history to the watershed. You know, think about it. We have sandhills, we have karst, we used to have coho, we have steelhead, we used to have foothill yellow-legged frog, we used to have red-legged frog, we do still have western pond turtles, lots of biodiversity. The cultural history is particularly interesting to me because it's really shaped the watershed, and we're still responding to the clear cuts of the turn of the 19th, 20th century and how that's changed fire dynamics, forest ecology, and all kinds of things. The road density in the San Lorenzo watershed, the septic tank density, all those things are huge watershed management concerns. Um, but I call it a working watershed. Um, and I'm happy to say that we see Henry Cowell as part of our watershed protection because the city's intake is just below, just downstream of Henry Cowell. And the water quality is usually better down there than it is coming into Henry Cowell. So it's, amazing the power of nature to heal, right? So having a natural system upstream of our intake is really a valuable thing for the city and also for all the other natural resource concerns that we have in the watershed.
Sir,
Yes,
why are you saying that it's better downstream than it is here?
because
What?
it's true.
I mean,
The coliform levels are lower. That's bacteria. I believe nitrate layers levels are often lower. Nitrate comes out of septic tanks and other like horse equestrian facilities.
Yeah.
There's an equestrian facility on Zione Road that's very close to the creek that is kind of the textbook example of, okay, if you're managing your watershed effectively, you really don't want to have an equestrian facility that drains right into the creek, especially when there's 100,000 people drinking that water downstream. So to get really into the weeds, we have various protocols where we measure the water quality on an ongoing basis in the river so that we have a good handle on, okay, the river is good to use for water now, for drinking water now, but other times maybe not. So, for instance, after storms, we'll wait till the river starts to clear up and we watch that very closely. And then we know, okay, it's not going to rain. The turbidity levels are below 10 NTU, which is the unit they measure turbidity in. And then we know that the water is safe to use. But so we, even though it's a developed watershed, there are most of the time, the water quality now is way better than it's been in the past. So to give a shout out for, I guess I should,
Sorry about that.
yeah, no worries. To me, that's the value of our environmental regulatory process is that since the 70s, the water quality in the river has improved. And it's really only around storming times that the river is not able to be used for drinking water. So that's positive. Yes.
Do you leave it to questions until the end? Because I think some of them might be answered in the presentation.
It might be, but
Yeah, but it's
put a pin in it, as they say.
Yeah. All right, sorry.
Can you remember?
No,
Okay, I won't either, but
I wanted to know about the impact of swimming in the park on the water quality. Is that the?
oh, great question. I think I actually had that in the end of my presentation, but I think the jury's a little bit out on that. However, I am aware that back in the day, there used to be a lot of flashboard dams on the river, and often they would be, I'll just use a technical term, flushed on a Friday before a weekend. And we would literally see the river turn turbid and basically have to turn the river out, which means the operators would not use the river for drinking water at that time. So I don't think they're inherently bad. But when they're operated to, if you let it go a couple weeks and then you flush it all at once, that's not a great thing. The dam building that goes on with these swimming holes is really not great. They do impede migration, and I'm pretty sure there's a pretty big dam right out here, and there's one up near the Zione confluence that's about yay high that fish are definitely not getting over. However, there is an argument about whether fish really need to move this time of year and what the value of those pools is for those fish. So it's not quite as clear what the impact is for the fishery in that regard. Say if the dams are knocked down in the fall and then fish can migrate when they normally migrate, that may be fine. You would probably want to do that around a storm so you don't throw out a big plug of dirty water during otherwise clear water conditions. But unfortunately, people that are building dams and recreating in the river are usually not thinking that deeply about how they actually manage those facilities. So I guess the answer is it depends, which is not a very helpful answer, but certainly they can have detrimental effect on water quality, mostly in terms of bacteria, but also turbidity.
Well, it's how the docents who are patrolling can help the river. And
Yeah.
so watching out for dams is what I heard you say.
Yeah, very much so. That's a direct thing that you can do to at least use it as an opportunity to talk with people and educate them about the river. I don't know that docents ordinarily get into enforcement work, so I'll leave that. I'll stay in my lane.
Education.
Yeah.
Education.
However, I will say that is actually a violation of state and federal law to build a dam. Granted, that happens all the time, and I don't see the wardens running out to arrest anybody, but if we were to do that, we would be liable to get cited by a warden for that kind of work without a permit. So it's hard to think of that when kids are just having fun in the river. And frankly, you want kids to have fun in the river, but there's sort of a, there's a balancing act there. Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so that's San Lorenzo, and now I'm stuck. Oh, there we go, Newell.
Okay.
So the Newell watershed is actually part of the San Lorenzo watershed. Of course, it's a sub watershed. That's where Loch Lomond is. We own half of the Newell watershed, which is nice because we can control what's happening there. The upper part of the Newell watershed that we don't control is large acreage timber parcels, wineries and cannabis parcels. That's, as mountain development goes, it's fairly innocuous. The lower part of the watershed is more residential, as most of you probably know, down by the landfill and below that. So the Newell watershed is actually a pretty cool watershed too, but mostly sedimentary rock there, a little bit of sand hills up on the ridge tops. I wouldn't say that there's much unique biota in the Newell watershed. It's pretty much the same as you would find in the rest of the valley. But that's where Loch Lomond is, and the water storage there is pretty important for the city. So the Majors watershed is, I think, an underappreciated watershed, one of the smaller watersheds we get water from, and we've been getting water from the Majors watershed since the late 1800s. That's one of the earliest water sources the city had access to. Again, lots of cool sandhills in the headwaters. There's asphaltum deposits on the east side of the watershed. Coastal terrace prairie. There's some old growth redwood in the Majors watershed. It's a watershed for a small watershed. We don't get a ton of water out of that anymore because we're providing a lot of water for fish these days. It only has a short run of about 3/4 of a mile of steelhead habitat, but it has tons and tons of red-legged frogs too. So that's kind of a cool watershed. Let's see. The Laguna watershed is another one of my favorites. We own a little bit of land in the Laguna watershed, about 800, no, I'm sorry, around 220 acres. But the Laguna watershed has it all. It has a rich, productive lagoon where steelhead grows big and strong before they go out to sea. Lots of tidewater gobies in the lagoon. Western pond turtles. We've got the sandhills in the headwaters. We've got karst, the marble outcrops up in the headwaters around the moon rocks and whatnot. And again, lots of rich history because there was mining and logging and water development and farming and all kinds of other things up there. So, and Laguna, I'm happy to say, has had coho reproduction in the last 10 years, which they hadn't been there in a long time until, frankly, we started putting water back in the streams. And lo and behold, even during the drought, we had wild coho in Laguna reproducing. So that's pretty awesome. Yeah. And then the Liddell watershed is another interesting watershed up the coast. I don't think there's any state parks property that overlaps with Liddell other than maybe the beach. Is the beach in state parks or is that in BLM? Bonnie Doon Beach is where the Liddell comes out.
State parks, just from memory.
Okay. Well, Liddell's interesting too, especially from a historical perspective, because I don't know if anyone has read Sandy Leiden's webpage or been in his class, but Liddell doesn't have a lagoon because of the way Highway 1 and the railroad crossed the creek. They filled in the creek and then they dug a bore to put the creek through out of their way so they didn't have to deal with that troublesome creek. But as a result, it doesn't have an estuary or a lagoon where fish can grow big and strong before they go out to sea. So it does have good flow because it's primarily a karst watershed, meaning metamorphosed limestone. So it has persistent cold flow in the even in drought years in the summer. So it does provide pretty good habitat for fish. However, that it's really missing that great rearing habitat down at the bottom that Laguna has. And then of course there's a lot of quarrying in the Liddell watershed, which is frankly can exacerbate the sedimentation in the creek where the whole creek is full of sand. It can actually change the runoff dynamics where Liddell, Majors Creek, for instance, is a very flashy stream, whereas Liddell hardly will even respond to a rainstorm because of the ground is basically just absorbing all of that because either of the quarries or the limestone. So this is what we do, broadly speaking. And of course, I enjoy the opportunity to show lots of exciting photos. But with developed watersheds like we have, we're dealing with everything from the CZU fire, which it's interesting to think that was only 5 years ago, because for most of us, we're still a little traumatized about it. But and back in the day, we did deal with a lot of illicit cannabis, not so much anymore, because most of that stuff is under control. At least it's more small scale nowadays. However, that has been something that we've dealt with in the past. We've spent a lot of time on habitat conservation planning, which I'll talk a little bit more further on. And water rights, we just had a big project wrap up, which I'll also talk about. But we also do a lot of education and monitoring, so I'm glad to be here today not that I'm necessarily educating you, but you might educate me. So it's a good opportunity to get out and talk about what we do. So habitat conservation planning, that's another term of art under the Endangered Species Act. Basically, to get authorization to work around endangered species, you have to have a habitat conservation plan, which describes what you're doing, how it's going to affect the species of interest, and how you're going to offset those effects. So we have 2 HCPs in Prosper actually being implemented, and one that should be done any minute now. I'm waiting for the email any day. And that's a big one. That's the anadromous salmonid habitat conservation plan that I've been working on since May of 2001. Yeah. So any minute. But we're making good progress on that. And you can't really see it behind this the panel here on the side, but we were happy to get an award from the federal government for our work with them on coho recovery there. Oh, there we go. So we've come a long way since the early days where we were frankly saying, how are we ever going to put water in the stream when we've got all this system demand and population growth pressure and whatnot? And lo and behold, after a quarter of a century of work, we've figured out how to basically reconfigure our water system and provide better flows in the streams for fish. So that's really gratifying. And for those of you that are familiar with Wilder, this is a red-legged frog from Majors Creek in Wilder, down near Highway 1. And again, Majors is just full of red-legged frogs. So if you ever want to see a red-legged frog, that's the place to go. Our low-effect Mount Herman June beetle HCP is only for our water treatment plant. Some of you may know on Graham Hill Road. Lo and behold, we have Mount Herman June beetles at the treatment plant. They weren't formerly known that far south because that's not typically considered sandhills there. However, there are some Zyanese sand deposits around the treatment plant, and there are some remnant stands of ponderosa pine and stuff, and the June beetles seem to have found them. So that's kind of an interesting little factoid. Some of the other species we cover under the operations and maintenance HCP are western pond turtle, Pacific lamprey, various sandhill species. I think there's 8 or 9 species in that HCP. So again, we have those so that we can fix pipelines and divert water and maintain roads and do fire management, fuel management for fire preparedness and stuff like that. We have probably close to 100 miles of pipeline. We have 38 miles of roads at Loch Lomond. We have almost 100,000 customers. So our operations span quite a range of Santa Cruz County. So the permitting needs are fairly great. Drinking water sanitary surveys. This is what came out of those mid-90s Safe Drinking Water Act requirements, that water purveyors with surface diversions had to do a survey of their watersheds and identify what the potentially contaminating activities are and how your treatment process is able to handle those and respond to them effectively. So we've done several of these. They're now due every 5 years. And frankly, they don't change much from year to year, or from 5 year to 5 year period. The same issues remain where we're dealing with road densities and septic tanks and the same kinds of contaminants year after year. There would have been periods where cannabis was a big issue. That's less so now. Frankly, the last 10 years or so, homelessness has been a big issue. Not that it hasn't always been, but the pressure on our creeks has been greater in the last 10 years or so for a variety of reasons. So we do see changes over time in the issues that we're addressing. And then we're, of course, supposed to recommend actions for dealing with that. And in the case of homelessness, I can talk a little bit about it more later, but we are definitely ramping up our patrols of the lower river so that we can try to get folks away from the river, at least away from the streams. We do have again, this is another 2-hour presentation just on this topic, but We have a multidisciplinary city team working on, okay, we've got shelter, we've got treatment. We've got alternatives. We recognize that just pushing people away from the river is not an answer, and nor is it a good use of public funds. So it's really gratifying that we're working with more of a multidisciplinary approach now on that, because what we were doing before doesn't work. Water rights is a super wonky thing that we do, and I won't bore you with this, but we just updated our water rights after another 20 years of work. Literally, we got the new order from the state board in June, and in a nutshell, what it allows us to do is to use water more regionally, and it guarantees bypass flows for fish. It also allows us to take more water in the winter when there's water in the streams, and to bank it in groundwater basins, and to avoid using Loch Lomond unless we absolutely need to. So it just gives us more flexibility to use water when it's available, but then leave water in the streams when the fish really need it. So that was another really gratifying thing to be a part of after 20 plus years, to get that order from the state board recently. And I mentioned lots of permitting otherwise, whether it's a pipeline leak on the North Coast. This is actually in Henry Cowell near 3 Mile, or Henry Cowell, I'm sorry, Wilder, where there were red-legged frogs breeding in the ditch that was created by the pipeline leak. So literally the water from the leak created habitat and frogs were breeding in it, which is an awkward situation. But I would say that's the value of relationships there, because I called the Ventura U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and they were like, can you just move them? And I'm like, sure. Yeah. So they worked with us pretty collaboratively on that, which was nice. So these are just some of the laws that we deal with. Frankly, a lot of us are wondering what's happening on the federal level, and without going down a political rabbit hole, I won't go there, but I'll just say that there's a lot of uncertainty around the federal regulatory structure, and even to the point of not having any staff at those agencies to call is a challenge. Take this case in point up by Wilder, where you've got a ditch full of red-legged frogs and you don't have a regulator you can call to consult on how you're going to deal with that. That's a problem. So I guess the jury's still out on how we're going to adapt to the new normal. But we do still have plenty of state laws that we need to comply with. So we're hopeful that the resources will still be protected by that regulatory framework. And we do a lot of open space management. So we have over or nearly 4,000 acres of land. We also manage some riparian license areas on private land on the lower San Lorenzo River, where one side of the river is city and one side is the county, which created a situation where we couldn't actually control what was going on the county land. And so we changed the municipal code so that we actually could enforce the muni code in county jurisdiction. And we have some landowner agreements that allows us to do that. And that gives us a lot of leverage to control both sides of the river down there by Pocanip and Ocean Street Extension, which is right above our intake. So it's really important that we have some control over that. And then, here in Henry Cowell, having open space means you have poaching, trespass, whatever else. We do our best to keep things down to a dull roar on the 4,000 acres that we're managing. And that means we have an on-staff forester, and we have rangers that patrol, and cameras everywhere. And so we do spend a lot of time on that. Oops. And let's not forget Loch Lomond. So Loch Lomond was built as the recreation area, not the reservoir, but the recreation area was a condition of our water right for Newell Creek. So most people thought we just sort of dabble in the recreation business, but no, that's actually a permit condition that we run a recreation area there. So it's obviously a popular spot. Sometimes too popular, the neighbors might say. We try to, that's a balancing act to sort of maintain a public trust resource, but also balance that with protection of the natural environment in the neighborhood and whatnot. So, and I'm just going to put a plug out there. This fall, early fall, late summer is a good time to go to the lake, especially during the week. So there are free boat rides on the Newell Jewel this weekend if anyone's interested. We have a pontoon boat up there. On August 30th, Lisa Robinson from the San Lorenzo Valley Museum is going to talk about the cultural history of the San Lorenzo Valley up there. So check your calendars. Education. We do a lot of education. Thankfully, I don't do most of it because talking to kids is a whole different skill set. So, one that I don't have. But I have some awesome staff that are really good at it, and the kids seem to be pretty stoked about it. We also do adult education. I've been happy to see some of you folks at those events at the Lock Walks at Loch Lomond. And we participate in various events as we're able to. But we do reach out to every fifth grade class in the public schools in Santa Cruz, sometimes third grade classes too, also San Lorenzo Valley Elementary, San Lorenzo Valley Middle School, and San Lorenzo Valley High School, and Bonnie Doon Elementary. And we're trying to get Live Oak back in. Live Oak fell out of our program, but we're trying to get them back. So we're pretty involved with that stuff. And that's one of those things where you don't see the payoff immediately, but I think is increasingly important over time. Just giving a shout out to my mom, the school superintendent. It's like, education always gets cut when times are hard, but then you pay for it 20 years later, right? So here we are now. And I guess in that vein, I should give you guys a shout out for trying to keep the faith and, engage people and build that public trust appreciation in the next generation and being stewards of our natural resources because we need that now more than ever. So, you don't get paid in anything other than trees and sunsets and hugs, but that's what our society runs on. So it's more important now than ever. Monitoring. I'm sort of more of a scientist at heart, so this is really my favorite thing, although all the other stuff is cool too. But the fisheries work we do is awesome. We seine the lagoons a few times a year. We do snorkel surveys on the North Coast creeks, where we actually go in the pools in dry suits and we count fish and we even size them. Today, my staff were out trying to practice sizing fish, which is, it's pretty hard when they're moving. It's like, did I already see that one? I saw one race by me, but did he come back or did she come back? And I'm really looking forward to having more coho in the stream because coho are just super chill. They just sort of sit there and look at you, and it's like, yeah, that's a coho, and I can tell because they're just sitting there looking at me. Anyway, and it shouldn't be forgotten that what we're doing is helping other agencies too. Like we're doing all this work because we want to maintain our permit compliance and be a local steward of our resources. But obviously the state and the federal agencies can benefit from the data we're getting as well. And we work pretty closely with them on that. So some of our challenges, I think most of you are probably aware of them, and I've already mentioned some of them, but water supply is obviously a challenge. We're not in a drought year right now, but and the lake is full, thankfully, but most of you probably remember 2014, 2015, and then 2020. It's like, let's have a drought and a fire and a plague. The list just keeps growing, right? So we forget about that quickly when it rains, but we know that it's coming again. Stream simplification is a big deal with people cutting up log jams. Granted, if your house is right next to the creek, it's kind of scary to have a log jam in your backyard, but most of our streams are pretty deprived of wood. If you go to streams and opens, like look at Waddell, the wood in Waddell is amazing. And that's what the fish need. And then you look at the San Lorenzo and you can walk right down it at low flow. So we really could use more wood in our streams. And one thing I'm sort of harping on is, can we develop some large wood refugia areas? Can we identify sites where, no, we're going to leave wood, maybe have some targeted management rather than, fire drills every winter when it rains. And even maybe do some wood augmentation in areas where it can work. And so frankly, we've partnered with state parks on projects like that in the past, more frog-oriented projects, but I think that's one benefit of our open spaces is we can actually do stuff like that. So it's like, okay, the residential areas with houses right next to the creeks may have no wood, but Henry Cowell might look really good. So, and Newell Creek for that matter, where we own property on Newell Creek or Zyanny, we've done some projects on Zyanny Creek too, where we built some log jams and they've been really successful, which is kind of nice to see. I know I'm not supposed to use the words climate change, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm just going to like go out on a ledge here. And so whether you call it weather whiplash or climate change or what have you, when did it stop raining this year? In March, pretty much. So we have a compacted wet season. We have a longer dry season. That means worse fire conditions. That means it's more challenging to serve 100,000 people water from surface sources. It means you could have a catastrophic fire with a long dry season, like 2020, which could drastically change your watershed, whether it's totally denuding the landscape like above Waddell or resulting in other species. Like we've seen vegetation maps for 2030, I think, that show no conifers south of the Golden Gate. Whether those models are accurate is, what's the saying? All models are accurate, but all models are wrong, but some are helpful. And when I think of that model, I think, well, yeah, do the math. If you had a long-term drought and then you had a big fire and all your fir and redwood died, what would come back? It's hard to imagine all the redwood dying because they're so resilient.
Right.
But if they were replaced with French broom and fir and tan oak, it would drastically change the watershed, not just in terms of the hydrology, but also in terms of, the species composition and all kinds of other things. So, if you think a little bit more deeply about what climate change means, even a couple degrees difference can mean the difference between coho using the San Lorenzo watershed or not. The main stem of the San Lorenzo is already too warm for coho during the summer, so they'll only use the tributary streams. But if say it gets a little bit warmer, maybe the tributaries won't provide the cold water they need. So I understand the term climate change is loaded, but if you're smart enough to sort of drill down and think about what it means in your local neighborhood, it's actually like, oh yeah, that could happen and that makes sense. And whether we can change it or not is another story. But I think first you have to acknowledge you have a problem before you can work on solving it, right? So that is certainly something we're thinking of, and we've done tons of modeling in spite of my having just said most models are wrong. One thing we did to address that was we ran a bunch of different models and sort of took the summary of the output to look at hydrologic scenarios 30 and 50 years out to just say, okay, what does this mean to our supply and what does this mean to habitat availability given various climate change scenarios? So solutions is something I always struggle to focus on, but something I think we all need to focus on. It's sort of like an exercise, right? If you don't exercise that solution-oriented muscle, then you're never going to have a strong approach towards solutions. So it's easy to go down the doom rabbit hole, but we also need to be mindful that positive change is possible and there are things we can do. So whether it's talking to kids building a dam in Henry Cowell or picking up the pet waste in your backyard if you live next to the river, or pumping your septic tank, there's basic stuff you can do. One thing I have drive less on here, and I think driving less is good in all kinds of ways, but one thing we have in the San Lorenzo River is 6-PPD, which is a byproduct of tires. The rubber in the tires has this antioxidant, which is actually toxic to coho. And we found fairly high levels here in Felton and also in Branciforte Creek below Highway 17 and Highway 1. So driving less is beneficial for the watershed in all kinds of ways, in addition to saving gas and saving wear and tear on your car and whatnot. Report poachers and polluters. This weekend, we have a south swell coming in and we have a big full San Lorenzo lagoon. And I predict that someone will try to breach the sandbar at Main Beach to try to get a standing wave or otherwise create better surfing conditions. So we'll be keeping an eye on that because that's something that can really drastically impact all the fish that we're trying to get big and healthy to go out to sea in the fall so that they'll come back next year and spawn. We want to protect that rearing habitat. So, I think it's good for docents to focus on education, but there is a time when enforcement is important too. So whether it's people fishing on non-fishing days here in the park or people breaching the sandbar, there's a reason why we have wardens. And we're lucky to have one of our wardens live in Boulder Creek. So she knows the neighborhood and she's very responsive. And that's something you can do is, build a relationship with your local wardens and be educated and help them do their jobs. And teach your children, which is what you're doing, right? So it's just super important we need to cultivate that next generation of conservationists and get them away from looking at their screens and get them having a little bit longer view and discovering the wonders of nature, right? So when they understand, like, if you protect the watershed, you'll have good clean water and you'll have good biodiversity. Those things don't have to be at odds with each other. They can actually be supportive of each other. Harkening back to my first interview with the city, my boss said, do you think that good habitat for steelhead is consistent with good water supply? And on the supply question, maybe there's a challenge, but in terms of water quality and public health, it's a no-brainer. I would way rather drink from a creek that can provide habitat for steelhead than a creek that can't, because I know that steelhead need very high quality water. So, that's a good place to start for human consumption. And just to prove positive change is possible. Okay, I talked about 2020 before, and it was really scary, and I'm sure most of you were here and lived through that. But in 2020, we also were able to provide quite a lot of water for the lower river for steelhead rearing. So 2020 was very similar to 1991, hydrologically speaking. And we were able to keep a minimum of 8 CFS, that's cubic feet per second, in the lower river for fish. Whereas in 1991, this is a mean daily flow. That's basically the average of the day. And someone will debate me mean versus average, and we won't go there. But a mean daily flow means that there were times when there was zero flow. So the graph doesn't go down to zero, but it goes pretty close to zero. And what it's missing is the 15-minute data where there were times where there was no flow in the lower river in 1991. And folks like Don Alley, who some of you may know, was there. And frankly, when I first started, reminded me that the city dried up the lower river in 1991. And I'm proud to say that we've done a much better job since then. So in 2020, amidst all the challenges we had then, we actually were able to keep good flow in the river. We had tremendous upsets with our operations because of the fire and because of furloughs and COVID and all the other things. But we were still able to keep some flow in the river. So never forget that even in trying times, you can still make a difference. And that's it for my formal presentation. So I'm happy to take questions or